here we're going to talk about trade creation and trade diversion. I'm going to deviate from the book. I'm going to do what I think is a conceptually easier exposition for people to grasp. So you have the way the textbook covers trade creation and trade diversion, and you're going to have this exposition as well. So you have two different ways of looking at it. I think this one's a little bit simpler and a cleaner and easier story to wrap your mind around. So what we have here is we have a scenario where we have the U.S. can get auto parts. Either it can produce the auto parts domestically, and it does so at a cost of $22, or we can import the auto parts from Mexico. Now, the base price of the auto parts coming from Mexico is $20 per part. Now, Asia is the lowest cost producer. The auto parts coming from Asia cost $19. So if we didn't have any tariffs whatsoever, then what we would have, of course, is that we would just buy all of our auto parts from Asia because it's the lowest price source. Okay, so, and here, we set aside, we separated out a scenario where we have the prices with the tariffs, the different tariff levels of 0, 10, and 20%, with NAFTA and without NAFTA, so no NAFTA. Now, of course, if you have no tariffs on auto parts to begin with, then putting NAFTA in place doesn't change anything. Okay? Let's start looking here at the scenario where it's a 10% tariff. So with the 10% tariff, the price of the auto parts from Mexico goes to $22, and from Asia, it's $20.90. So in this case, we would get our auto parts from Asia, right? They're still the lowest price auto parts. Okay? Now, if the tariff was 20% and we don't have NAFTA, now we end up raising, right, with that 20% tariff, the price of the auto parts from Mexico, that price goes to 24. The price for an auto part coming from Asia goes to $22.80. There we would actually end up buying only domestically made auto parts. We wouldn't end up importing any because the tariff effectively prices out the imported goods. Now, what if we went to a slightly, now change the scenario, go back to the 10% tariff, and so I'm going to highlight here this choice in blue. Okay, so this is the blue is the known NAFTA outcomes. And now in yellow, let's go and circle where we would buy the goods from if we had NAFTA in place. Okay. So if we put NAFTA in place now, we'll get rid of the tariff on the Mexican auto parts only, right? So NAFTA is the US, Canada, and Mexico. So the price goes back down to $20. But we keep the 10% tariff on the Asian auto parts, so that price stays at $20.90. Both of these prices are lower than the US price. If we're talking about domestically made auto parts, but Mexican parts are the cheapest. So now we would get our auto parts from Mexico rather than from Asia. Okay? So with a 10% tariff, what happens when we start off in a scenario where we've got a 10% tariff and no NAFTA? Initially, we import the auto parts from Asia, but then we switch to importing those auto parts from Mexico. Right? So we're diverting our trade. Right? That's where this idea of trade diversion comes from. Okay? We're diverting trade away, and the important thing is here, we're diverting it away from the lowest cost producer. Right? Asia produces those auto parts and sells them on the world market at a lower price than the Mexican producers do. So now we're switching our imports from Asia to Mexico. Now what we can illustrate, and so we're going to just use a domestic supply and demand graph here. All right, so here's our price, and then our quantity here. Okay. We've got a demand curve. And now what we're going to have is we're just going to have, instead of upward sloping supply curves, we're just going to have these horizontal prices, where we're saying, look, this is the price. Domestic consumers can buy as much as they want at whatever price we have here. So what are the relevant prices? So we'll put the US price, say here. Right, that's the price of the US produced goods, which is $22. Right? Now, what are the other two prices that we need to consider? So if we're talking about this 10% tariff case, so when we have, for Mexico, if we're starting off with the tariff, it's actually also equal to the price of the Mexican auto parts plus the tariff. Okay. For Asia, their price with the auto part for auto parts with the tariff is $20.90. Okay. So that price would be there. So here we have, right, price in the U.S. for the U.S. auto parts and the price for the Mexican-made auto parts plus the 10% tariff. Those are $22. The price of the Asian auto parts with that 10% tariff is $20.90. So now we also need to put in what the prices would be without the tariff. Okay? So without the tariff, the Mexican auto parts would be $20. And the Asian auto parts would be $19. No, I'm not drawing things proportionately here. I want to give enough space so you can clearly see the different areas. So we start off with the case of if we have tariffs on the goods from both countries, right? So we start off with this scenario. Okay? What are we doing? We know that we are going to be buying our auto parts from Asia at a price of $20.90. So we're starting off at this point here. Okay? And we're going to be importing or consuming, rather, in general, a quantity one, and that's all imports, right? Because here we're the domestic, the U.S. auto parts producers price too high, so we don't have any domestic production at this point, right? Or at least we're not consuming any domestically made goods. So that's one way we're making the example pretty simple and straightforward is now when we go to moving from the case of buying the auto parts from Asia with the 10% tariff implied to both Mexican and Asian produced auto parts, when we go to moving to the scenario where we join or form NAFTA and eliminate the tariffs on the auto parts from Mexico, we're going to do what we've been doing the last couple chapters. We're looking at changes in government revenue and in producer and consumer surplus, but we don't have to worry about producer surplus in this case because the U.S. producers aren't selling anything. So the only thing we have to do now is track the change in consumer surplus and in the government revenue. So it makes the analysis just that much simpler. So we start off here. Now when we eliminate the tariff, what are we doing? We end up consuming these goods here. Okay, this amount, call that Q2, and we're importing them at this price. So now what's actually happening here? So let's track some of these different areas. So got A, B, and C here. And so what we've got, let's look at these changes. So what's the change in the consumer surplus? Well, consumers are now, instead of paying $20.90 and consuming at Q1, they're paying $20 and consuming at Q2, so they're gaining A plus B. So we don't have to worry about the producers, right? And there's no producer surplus here, but we do have to track the government revenue. And what we have here is the areas, right? They're losing the tariff. This is the key thing to keep in mind here, right? When we buy the auto parts from Mexico, when we're in NAFTA, there's no tariff anymore. So the government is losing the tariff revenue equal to A and C. So that leaves us with a net effect of B minus C. So what are these two areas? Well, take a look at B here. This is the gain in consumer surplus that's coming from the fact that we're now increasing our consumption from Q1 to Q2. We're now buying these goods that are generating additional surplus. Okay? If you look at this, right, this is the gain. This part's a gain in surplus that's not coming as a transfer from anyone else. B is our trade creation effect. And what about C? Well, C is the lost tariff revenue that's not going to the consumers, right? So A and C are both from the government's perspective loss of revenue, but A is being basically as a transfer from the government back to the consumers by not charging the tariff on that good, right? But C, this is the tariff revenue we're losing, right? It's a part of the tariff revenue we're losing, but it's coming at the expense of the fact that we're now buying from the higher cost producers, right? The Mexican producers who have a $1 higher cost of producing the goods than the Asian producers do. So C is our trade diversion effect. Now, the way I've drawn the example here, it looks like the trade diversion effect is actually larger than the trade creation effect. And it's just the way I drew this particular example. But it illustrates an important point. So early on, economists, trade economists in particular, had basically universal agreement that these multilateral trade agreements, like the EU, NAFTA, ASEAN, right? You think about all these regional trade agreements, that they were beneficial because they were lowering trade barriers and would lead to more trade globally. And in general, that should be the case, but the wrinkle in all of this is that we may create these scenarios where we divert trade. Right? We divert it away from buying from the lowest cost producers, and now we procure those goods, we import from the trade partners instead. So the question then becomes, well, what determines the relative size of the trade creation and trade diversion effects? Well, for one thing, you want to look at what's the cost difference between the two countries, right? Specifically between Mexican auto parts and Asian auto parts. Right? So if we make that gap a little smaller, so let's say the Mexican auto parts only cost a little more than $19. In that case, we'd be all the way out, and our consumption would increase to Q3. So now B would become this larger triangle here, right? We'd get a much larger trade creation effect because the price would drop potentially more. And also the other thing you should note is that we'd have an even smaller than before trade diversion effect, right? Remember, the trade diversion effect is driven by the size of the cost difference between the two potential suppliers. Right? So as that cost difference gets smaller and smaller, the trade diversion effect becomes smaller, and the possibility for even more trade creation when we eliminate the tariff will be even larger. That's one part of it. So the size and the cost differences. The other aspect you have to look at is the elasticity of the demand curve. Right? If I were to have drawn this demand curve to be much flatter, so I'll rotate it around our initial point here. If I had drawn it, say, like this, then what you would see is as I lower the price from 2090 down to 21, again here, I would have ended up with a larger, I call that quantity Q4, I would have ended up with this size of a trade creation effect. Okay? So two key things you want to look at when you're trying to figure out what's likely to dominate the trade diversion or the trade creation effect. You have to consider the cost difference between the two potential suppliers, right? The Asian auto parts producers and the Mexican auto parts producers. And you also have to think about how much of a trade creation effect we're going to get, which will depend on the elasticity of demand for auto parts. Okay? And there's no set answer. It's not like you're going to necessarily have, even in terms of NAFTA, if you look from one market to another, you won't necessarily get the same answer, right? So in auto parts, it could be that trade diversion outweighs trade creation, but in terms of fresh fruit, that the trade creation effect outweighs the trade diversion effect. Right? It's going to depend on these different forces, which are going to be industry, or even in some cases you could say really product specific.